So, Eileen, we talked about this at the beginning of the episode a little bit, but separation as a concept is maybe unknown in a lot of churches or maybe viewed in a very negative light. Why do you think that is, and where might that negative reaction to separation be coming from for a lot of people?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is cultural, just this idea of a separation. A lot of church circles haven't heard about a therapeutic separation or a healing separation. And they might even quote Bible verses that say, whoever God has joined together, let no man separate. And so they hear that and they think that you're just trying to get out of the marriage, or you're not being faithful to your marriage vows. Right. So I think that's part of it. I think this idea that they have to stay together. And that bothers me a little bit because they don't understand about healing. Being in a church where they don't understand addiction in particular, they might not understand that the time apart can actually enhance the marriage. It can make the marriage better.
So that came to mind as you were saying that was how that you can have a misunderstanding around the passage too of like not withholding your body from your spouse, and that assumption that that means what it means. Like even if it's uncomfortable or unsafe for you, like this is your duty as a spouse to offer your body to your partner. And I think that misunderstanding is a similar kind of perspective that can be I think projected onto this situation too, where it's so funny. And I know that we tend to think this way, but if I quote that verse, it could be very black and white in my head, and black and white is very easy to process. It's easy to communicate, but this situation is not black and white. It's very gray. And I think that can often be a reaction that the church has, is this makes it a lot messier and harder to talk about, harder to measure what does success look like. And I really don't think that that's a good enough reason to not step into a healthy separation or to evaluate our perspectives on topics like this. But I think that that's maybe a motivation that the church has, or I don't know if motivation is the right word, but just a perspective I think we can carry into a lot of different topics.
I also think that there's some discomfort with other people's pain.
No question.
So I think that can be a lot of it is, and I worked with a couple Bill and I worked with a couple, and there's a lot of just lack of information, kind of ignorance on this subject. One pastor told a spouse, well, your spouse isn't, he's not doing that behavior anymore, so why aren't you having sex? And just this idea, very black and white thinking, not understanding safety or the need for feeling connected, for feeling emotionally connected and emotionally safe for the spouse. It was just very much, well, this is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, there can be some theology issues, I think, undergirding it. We often quote Genesis 2, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And so we think of this concept that the two are united, they're one flesh, and it may feel like, well, if they're not living under the same roof, they're no longer united, or they're no longer one flesh. And we almost forget that, that's more of a metaphorical spiritual description. It may be entirely possible that in order to give the unity of the marriage the best chance to be preserved, in order to preserve oneness, the separation may be a part of that for a time, but it doesn't mean they're not still one flesh or not united just because they're not physically living under the same roof at every moment. And so I think if we allow for that viewpoint of, we're actually trying to increase the oneness in that marriage, which has been totally destroyed, by the way. We're talking about healthy separation in light of betrayal over issues like pornography and affairs and stepping outside the marriage, where the oneness has already been deeply fractured. And yet now we're trying to hold the spouses to some kind of ideal of oneness to put it back together that's actually could be working against them, where a separation might give them the tools needed to re-engage in the kind of oneness and unity that I think Scripture would really call us to. And another thing that comes to mind for me is just, I know in my upbringing, separation was never really talked about on its own. It was always separation and divorce. You read chapters in marriage books, it's dealing with separation and divorce. As a pastor, when I learned how to work with couples, it's like working with couples in separation and divorce. And we just put the two together so synonymously that I think when we hear separation, there may be that fear that rises of, oh no, they're getting divorced, because we hear the and even if someone didn't say it.
Yeah.
And so if we can allow a category where separation on its own might be defining a phase of someone's healing journey and a very necessary phase, then I think we could kind of readjust how we hear and react to that word separation in our church communities.
Yeah, I think of for better and for worse, right? And it doesn't get much worse. If you don't feel safe with your spouse, that's the worst. And it doesn't mean that you're going to end up in divorce. It means that we need to amp up the level of care. And that doesn't necessarily mean separation. That can mean inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment.
Yeah.
There are lots of levels of care. And so it really depends on the situation.